Hey guys, so Infinite Forbidden is right around the corner, of course, and Branded Despia is still one of the pretty solid deck options out there, and it's also a nice positive that you don't need the Fiendsmith engine to play this deck. So a couple months ago, I did bring an overview in terms of, how to play Branded Despia, going over some of the more basic lines of play in terms of, what happens when you actually resolve Branded Fusion. But for this video, I'll cover kind of playing around and playing through hand traps as sort of the next step in terms of the how to play guide. So definitely go check out that first video if you haven't already. Also, speaking of Infinite Forbidden, definitely go check out those pre-orders on Tier 0 games as well as Card Brawlers. They should be up either at the time of this video coming out or shortly after, and you can use code Hakuna5 for 5% off. But with that being said, let's just get right into the tips. Alright, so for the first example, I actually wanted to show you playing around Nibiru, or rather playing through Nibiru, because, Ash is obviously the most concerning hand trap, but we'll cover that later. I just wanted to show sort of like the most common place you would get Nibiru and how you could potentially still gimmick lock through that. So let's say in this hand, you kind of have like your ideal preference of having like access to Branded Fusion plus Cartesia access. So of course, you would start off, speaking of playing around hand traps, obviously you want to play around Imperm as much as possible. You're going to use the Fusion Deployment, reveal that Granule, and special out the Cartesia, and then you would of course normal summon the Aluber, and you're going to add yourself the Branded Fusion. So for this case, let's say it does resolve and your opponent does not have Ash, and you can check my part 1 video in terms of kind of like the default line of play you should be making when you have Aluber access or any dark monster access. So we're going to first start off sending the Albaz and the Lobelian to special out the Albion, and then you're going to use its effect to fuse, in which case you will go banish the Albaz as well as the Aluber on the field, and you will make the Lobelian, and then you're going to use Lobelian effect, just pitch whatever card, and then to fuse into the Mirror Jade. So here you would bring back the Albaz, put that back, this will also go back, and then you will summon out the Mirror Jade here. So now at this point, when you're going to summon out the Lobelian, this is the most common space. Like, your opponent will Nibiru you here, because otherwise you get access to Branded Lost, and they just don't want you to do that, and this is sort of like the best spot basically. So now at this point, what you can do, so let's say your opponent activates Nibiru, okay? So there's a couple things you can do. One is, the order doesn't necessarily matter, but you can go chain Cartesia effect, and then also chain Mirror Jade effect, and you're going to send something like the Titanic Clad. So here, make sure that, ideally if you had another monster you could banish that, but just so you could get Mirror Jade and Nibiru so that it can like trigger and nuke effect, but it's okay, that's more of a minor inconvenience. So we'll just get rid of the Lobelian, and then we're going to fuse these two into the Granule. Unfortunately, it does immediately get tributed for that Nib token, so you do not get to send off the Granule there. Also, I should mention this, playing through Nibiru actually still works with this line of play, even if you only play one Granule, and I know the more common option nowadays is to play two, because people cut Super Poly. Anyways, at this point, so now, because a monster was special summoned using a monster effect, you can actually use Granule's effect in the grave to special out something like the Quem, and then use Quem effect to dump. So in this case, again, we're trying to gimmick lock still here, and so you can send, what we need is a dark target for Branded in red. It can technically be Albaz, but because we're going to be banishing it later, it's better to go with something more expendable like the Shrouded Dragon here. So at this point, we can actually just go right into end phase actually. So what's going to happen is you have, for example, you have the Albion effect, and you're going to set the Branded in red, and then you have the Titanic Cloud effect, and you're actually just going to straight up add the Fallen of Albaz to hand, and this is going to be set. So now, you're going to have to let, unfortunately, you're going to have to let your opponent go into the main phase, because you need to trigger that Cartesia effect. So pretend your opponent also has a Nibiru on the field. So hopefully they start with something like, let's say, like, I don't know, Terraforming as an example, something that isn't like Dark Ruler. Anyways, let's pretend it's your opponent's main phase. Now what you can do is you're going to go Branded red. So you're going to target the Shrouded Dragon. This is treated as Fallen of Albaz in the graveyard. And then you're actually going to use these two. And then you're going to go into the Lobelian again. So now you're going to go Chainlink 1 Lobelian, pitch another card, Chainlink 2 Quem, and you're going to target that Cartesia. I should have mentioned earlier that it's important to leave that Cartesia in the grave in this instance, just because you can also add to hand in the end phase, of course, but in this instance, we actually do need it on the field. So we're gonna bring out the Cartesia here, and then we're gonna resolve that Lubellion, and we're actually gonna bring back the Sanctifier, or rather the Granule and the Albaz that's already banished, because this is actually spellcast, remember. So now you put this back, and you can actually summon out the Sanctifier. So now at this point, you can go Cartesia effect. You happen to have a Nibiru token, which is light. Honestly, even if you didn't have it, you still have Lubellion at least, where you can go into that Granule that you just returned back with Lubellion. And now you trigger its effect, and you can go and dump that gimmick. And then now you can go Sanctifier effect. You can target the gimmick as well as the Mirror Jade that you fused off earlier, which is why it's important that you put it in the grave rather than banishing it. So then you can summon that Mirror Jade. You can also give your gimmick puppet to your opponent, and now they are locked. It's also important that because now your opponent would still have a Nibiru at this point, you have a Mirror Jade that can at least banish the Nibiru that they're going to try to attack to crash into Sanctifier with. You could always put it in defense mode. Important, I would say, to put Mirror Jade in defense mode in this situation as well, because you did use effects in the main phase, so your opponent could like talents, take your Mirror Jade, for example. If you get rid of their Nibiru, then just crash into Sanctifier. But anyways, this is just an example of how you can still gimmick lock through Nibiru even if you only play one Granule. Now, something super quick I wanted to mention is one thing about if you're kind of new to playing this deck, in terms of prioritizing which hand traps you want to play around, I would say you want to play around, like, for example, Imperm over something like Droll. Obviously, when you see branded opening, oftentimes you're going to be playing it in draw phase so that you can at least play around Droll a little bit better. But in the case where you have Cartesia, let's say you hard drew it and you have to you have the option of normal summoning it first, I would still prefer to do that first and then go opening, pitch, and then you summon the Aluber, and then use its effect to search out Brand Fusion to help you protect from Imperm, Veiler, Ghostmourner of the like. I think that is more important to play around than Droll. Even though, let's say you add the Brand Fusion and then you get Drolled, at the very least, that's a lot better than getting just Imperm by starting with this. So just some things to keep in mind. Alright, so let's cover an example where you're trying to play around Ash, but also more so, this deck is more so about playing through Ash, realistically, but this is an example that can come up where you have something like Aluber and let's say Albaz and Cartesia, and technically, or this could have been like a Brand Fusion, like any kind of combination works, where essentially, you know, if you commit to like the normal Aluber, which you most likely will, if you do get ashed on the Brand Fusion, then you're really tough in luck. If you're hit with Imperm, unfortunately, in this kind of hand, like you will really get screwed. But in this case, so for example, instead of adding Brand Fusion, what you could actually do is add High Spirits. And you could argue, hey, what if the opponent ashes your High Spirits when you start with it instead? Because obviously in this hand, we don't actually have Brand Fusion. Realistically though, you know, if you're a branded player, or rather you're playing as a branded player, they add this and they have 5 cards in hand still, they're probably not going to be ashing this anyways. So here you do this and you will reveal the Albaz. You have the option of sending usually like a Titaniclad or Albion Dragon. I would say by default, it is going to be Titaniclad, especially when you're sort of starting out your turn 1 play. So what you can do is send these two, and then you can actually add the kit, which is nice to have, that it is something that can be added off cards like these and also can get you access to Brand Fusion. So now, because you have a Fallen of Albaz in graveyard, you can go with the Cartesia summon. And then you can also, because you have a fusion monster that mentions Fallen of Albaz's material, you can actually special summon Kit as well. You can use its effect to add. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of this is that you do have to put a card to the bottom of the deck. But at this point, at least if you are ashed on Brand Fusion, you still have some plays with like the Cartesia access compared to just ending on Aluber alone, essentially. So let's say you go Brand Fusion and your opponent ashes you. Okay, in that case now, you can go, and this is a card in hand by the way, and then you can go Cartesia effect into the Granule, and you're going to use Granule effect. In this case, let's dump the Albion Dragon. This is where the second Granule will actually be quite useful. Anyways, while it doesn't look like much, you can now go into end phase. You have something like the Albion effect, and you're going to set that brand in red. You still have that 1 card in hand, so that's going to be set. You have the Titaniclad, and that is going to help you summon out the Quem and that effect. Honestly, it depends on what you want to dump. Realistically, if you want to add a Cartesia to hand, because you do still need 1 in the graveyard for this gimmick lock to work, you could technically just send another one, because you're just going to get 1 back to your hand. Keep in mind something like High Spirits, because you already used the other effect this turn, you're not going to be able to add it back. But just make the habit of always checking your grave in every end phase in case the next turn it might come up. So anyways, at this point, this is of course set, and now you can actually just pass turn again. So now, similar to like the Nibiru example, you're gonna unfortunately have to let your opponent go into main phase, but let's say they do something that's not that meaningful, then now you can go Branded Red, target the Albaz, and you would just banish these two, and then you can again summon out the Sanctifier, and then now of course Quem can trigger, and you can bring back the other Cartesia here that you left in grave. And then similar to like that last situation, essentially you have Cartesia effect now. You can go into your second Granule, dump the Gimmick Puppet, and then just puppet lock your opponent again through that. Alright, so let's just cover another scenario where you're having Ash in mind from the opponent. So let's say you have a hand like this where you have Branded Fusion access, but your Cartesia access would be something like from Branded Opening, dump Cartesia off of Quem. Now you could, by habit, go with this, in draw phase, for example, and dump like the Cartesia off Quem. But the thing is, that could potentially be greedy, right? Because if your Branded Fusion doesn't actually resolve, it kind of ends up being wasted because you just have basically a Luber and Quem on the field, and Cartesia on the grave might not do anything. Whereas if you did start with a Luber first, you go with the Branded Fusion. If it does get Ash, perhaps with Quem, maybe you dump something like Albaz. Maybe that ends up being better depending on what you might have in your hand. Let's say like if you hard drew like Branded Red or something. So at the very least, it's not a big thing, but at the same time I think it's a little safer to do. Let's say you start with the Aluber and you add the Branded Fusion. So essentially you could go Branded Fusion and just check if your opponent has Ash. If they say Branded Fusion is fine, then you can just chain the Branded Opening here, and you can just pitch a card and you summon out the Quem in this instance, and then you're going to resolve that Branded Fusion, sending Albion, or rather Albaz and Lubellion to bring out the Albion Dragon. So at this point you're going to go Chainlink 1, Albion, Chainlink 2, Quem to dump. You can technically use its other effect as well in the same chain in terms of reviving. There's no reason to do that right now because there's nothing worthwhile. So you're going to resolve that first, and then now dumping the Cartesia, and then you can resolve the Albion by banishing the Albaz as well as Aluber and bring out the Lubellion in this instance, and then you can go effect Chainlink 1 and then Quem Chainlink 2, bring back the Cartesia, and then this will just go back, as well as the Albaz here will go into the deck, and you can just bring out the Mergate. So now you're kind of in the situation, you're like a default scenario that I covered in part 1, because now you can just go Lubellion here, bring out the Branded Lost, and then you can go Fuse into the Granule, Chainlink 1 Granule, Chainlink 2 Lost. Because you don't have or Branded in red target, you're going to want to add the Albion the Shrouded Dragon, and then dumping the Gimmick Puppet, and of course just use this effect. You're going to dump that Albaz, go back to the bottom of the deck, you draw a card, and then end phase you have the Albion effect to trigger to bring back the Branded Red. You also have the Cartesia that you can add. So just wanted to show that sequencing that you can do just for awareness. Now, primarily related to Ash, just wanted to cover obviously the most basic cards that are seen in pretty much every branded list nowadays. Call by the Grave, there's really nothing to say about there. That's very obvious. And of course, Thrust, setting the Fusion Duplication. Crossout is another option, of course, but I would say for the most part, you're not really seeing that see play anymore in the branded list. I think one of the downsides of Crossout, for me at least, I never liked having to, play Crossout and all your different like hand trap targets, and maybe even D-Barrier going second, without even knowing for sure whether your opponent are actually even on those cards, so it's potential dead space. So I would say for the most part you're not going to see crossouts anymore. Fusion Duplication, I want to talk about this because it's become popular to play this in multiple copies, even at 3. I've been actually testing it out at 2, and I think that's still fun. If you don't want to pay for Thrust, which is totally understandable, I would say just max out on the copies of Fusion Duplication for sure. It's honestly quite strong, especially whether you get Ash or whatever. Sometimes let's say you get Droll, but you manage to get like, let's say, a Branded Fusion into the grave because, let's say, I don't know, like opening and then like send like a Serenir or something, dump Branded Fusion. So there's definitely, it can really help. And also of course it can copy other fusion spells, which can come pretty handy. So these are kind of like the most generic ways in terms of playing through Ash if you were to hard draw these guys. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is, honestly, even through Ash, sometimes you can still set up the gimmick log at least, like, right, as long as you have some kind of like granular access, and let's say some other hard drawn pieces like Brandon Red, or let's say Albaz, like Gimmick Puppet, there are definitely lines where even through Ash, you're going to find yourself being in a position to like gimmick lock. So the deck is still, for the most part, pretty good, but of course, there's always going to be hands that are vulnerable to even just like one hand drop, but you can say that about a lot of different decks. And I guess to cap off just some random other tips, some of the things that you should know with, let's say you use Albion Effect in hand, let's say you dump something like Retribution, which is a common one that you will send. You can always like chain certain other things, like let's say for example you had a High Spirits in hand, you can always chain and like send the dragon, send this to the grave as well, and just add whatever, like, and of course you're not going to be able to draw off this anymore, but some things to watch out or keep in mind of. Or let's say you got a Cartesia on field, and let's say this was just happened to be your only dark monster in hand, you could always send this, chain Cartesia, sorry, just pretend you didn't have that, and then like make Granule, dump Serenia, and now you can actually have access to Branded Fusion that way, because you don't want to kind of like risk it all and hope that you draw another Dark Light with Shadow Dragon in that case, for example. Other random examples I would say is sometimes, let's say like Quem got Imperm, and let's say I summon something like Albion Effect, even though it is negated, you can still attempt to negate the, or rather, you can still attempt to activate the effect, right? It will resolve negate it, but at the same time, if you go, let's say like 1 Albion and then 2 Quem, target something, it's not going to matter, it's not going to revive obviously because it's negated, but I would like to still do that just to chain block yourself from potentially, let's say your opponent has like a Ghost Spell or something, and you help protect your Albion Effect to fuse to go through. Lastly, one thing that did come up for me in the past is under Shifter, you actually cannot use like Mercure effect to like, you know, negate a monster effect, because this has to be able to go to the graveyard. So unfortunately, it's not going to work out that way. So if you happen to have like Loss on the field as you fuse when you got Shifted, don't bother adding this. You're not going to have that monster negate. Although funnily enough, if you were to pitch Tragedy for cost under Shifter specifically and it gets banished, it actually is still considered as being banished by card effect, so you will still get to add off Tragedy in that scenario, even though normally obviously you would not be able to add if it's pitched for cost. Alright guys, so that was it for the Branded Despia Part 2 how to play video. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any other questions or tips that you wanted to share in the comments, feel free to do so, and we can all try to help each other. With that being said, definitely a big thanks to all of you for watching. Huge thanks to all my patrons and sponsors as well for the continued support, and well, hope to see a lot of you at the NAWCQ. Take care guys.